The story of Elijah Anderson is one that seems destined for oblivion, a tale so extraordinary it should have captured the imagination of generations. Instead, it has slipped through the cracks of history, its details obscured by time, suppression, and an intentional erasure from the records. Elijah Anderson was a man who, despite the brutality of slavery, managed to rise above his circumstances, becoming a symbol of hope and defiance. His life was one of immense potential, marred only by a cruel and deliberate disappearance from the historical narrative. But who would want to erase such a man? And why? It was a late summer afternoon in a small Kentucky town, a place where the air hung thick with the ghosts of the past, and the trees whispered stories from long ago. There, amidst the decaying remnants of the once bustling streets, an investigator sat, reviewing a stack of yellowed papers. On the surface, they seemed like typical records from a bygone era, dusty legal documents, faded letters, and barely legible maps, but beneath this veneer was something far more sinister. Each document hinted at the same eerie conclusion: Elijah Anderson, a man once celebrated for his courage and leadership, had been deliberately erased from history. The weight of this revelation felt almost oppressive. How could this have happened? The investigator leaned forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned a page to a letter, dated 1865, that mentioned Anderson in passing. It was the only surviving mention of his name in the town's historical archives. The letter, written by a local abolitionist, described Anderson as a man of promise, destined for greatness, yet there was little else about him in official records. His name didn't appear in census reports, municipal documents, or any historical accounts of the period, even though he had been an active participant in the abolitionist movement. The only place his name was remembered was in the stories told by the few who had known him personally, stories of a brilliant, charismatic man who had been unjustly erased. As the investigator continued to sift through the archives, a deeper, more unsettling realization began to take shape. Elijah Anderson's disappearance was not an accident. It wasn't a case of historical oversight. It was deliberate. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase his existence from the historical record, to bury his name beneath layers of lies and silence. But who, and why? The answer to that question lay in the historical context of the time, a time when the struggles for freedom and equality were often silenced by those who stood to lose the most from progress. Kentucky, a border state caught between the Union and the Confederacy, was a place where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred, where powerful forces sought to maintain the status quo of slavery and oppression. Anderson had been a beacon of resistance in a land that thrived on subjugation. His story was dangerous to the established order. He had become an influential figure in the fight for freedom, and his erasure was not just a matter of personal obscurity but a calculated effort to prevent his story from inspiring future generations. But who would go to such lengths to erase his legacy? The question lingered in the investigator's mind as he walked through the town, where the ruins of old homes and businesses stood as silent witnesses to a forgotten past. The once thriving town had all but vanished, its historical significance overshadowed by its participation in the institution of slavery. The local church, which had once served as the heart of the community, now lay abandoned, its walls crumbling, its stained-glass windows shattered. It was a place where the most influential figures of the town had once gathered to discuss matters of politics, religion, and community, and yet, not a single soul seemed willing to speak of Elijah Anderson. It was as though his very name had become a forbidden topic. The investigator stopped in front of a dilapidated building that had once been the local courthouse. In its prime, it had been a place where justice was meant to be served, but in truth, it had been a place where the powerful had used their influence to perpetuate the system of slavery. Anderson had fought against this system, and perhaps that was why his story was so dangerous. The courthouse was the very symbol of the establishment that sought to suppress his memory, to ensure that the world would forget the man who had fought for the freedom of his people. As the investigator walked past the courthouse, a chill wind began to blow, stirring the dust and debris in the street. The air grew heavier, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be uncovered. It was in this atmosphere, thick with forgotten history and lost stories, that the true scope of Elijah Anderson's erasure began to take hold. He was not just a man forgotten by history, he was a man intentionally buried, his name buried beneath layers of lies and silence. The deeper the investigator delved into the town's history, the more he uncovered troubling signs of deliberate distortion. Old records that should have included Anderson's name were either missing or had been tampered with. Newspaper articles that had once chronicled his involvement in abolitionist efforts had been torn from the archives. Even the local cemetery, which had once served as the final resting place for many of the town's most notable figures, had no record of Anderson's burial. In fact, there were no records of his death at all. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation took the investigator to local historians, some of whom were willing to share the few details they knew about Anderson's life. But their accounts were fragmented, contradictory, and often vague. One historian described Anderson as a revolutionary figure, while another described him as an unassuming man who had no business being remembered. The stories of those who knew Anderson were similarly conflicting. Some painted him as a man of immense promise, others as a figure who had somehow overstepped his bounds. But what all these accounts had in common was the undeniable sense that something had been deliberately hidden, something vital had been erased. In one particularly revealing conversation, a local historian revealed that, according to old family lore, Anderson had been a threat to the powers that be in the region. He had been vocal in his opposition to slavery and had worked with abolitionists to help enslaved people escape. His name had been known in the town, but after the Civil War, it seemed to vanish from every document, every record. The historian spoke of a meeting that had been held in secret, where it was decided that figures like Anderson had to be silenced, not just politically but also from memory itself. His influence had been too great, his message too powerful. As the investigation progressed, the investigator began to see a pattern, a dark, deliberate effort to erase Anderson's legacy. What was it that had made him such a threat to the establishment? What had Anderson done that had caused those in power to go to such lengths to erase him from the historical record? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: the erasure of Elijah Anderson was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger effort to silence the voices of those who had fought for freedom, for justice, for equality. It was a reminder that history is not just about what is recorded, but about what is deliberately left out, what is buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As the day turned to dusk, the investigator stood at the edge of the town, looking out over the vast, empty land. The fading light seemed to emphasize the silence, the stillness, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. Elijah Anderson's story had been buried for far too long, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was finally time for it to be uncovered. The Kentucky landscape was rich with the weight of history, its rolling hills, the dense forests that stretched for miles, the rivers that had carved deep channels through the earth over centuries. But beneath this natural beauty was a history that often felt hidden, buried beneath layers of oppression, conflict, and bloodshed. This was especially true for the town of Anderson's birth, a small settlement nestled along the banks of the Ohio River, where the struggles of enslaved people and the forces of resistance had once been intertwined. In the mid-1800s, it was a town that thrived on the back of slavery, a place where the institution had deep roots. It was also a place where Elijah Anderson's legacy would eventually vanish. The town had once been a bustling hub for both free people and enslaved individuals. Its main street was lined with stores and homes, and on any given day, the sounds of bartering, haggling, and conversation would fill the air. The people who lived there were proud of their town's prosperity, built on the cotton and tobacco trade, and they were deeply embedded in the Southern system of plantation slavery. However, the tension that simmered in this community was palpable. The town, which had been founded in the early 1800s, existed in the shadow of a moral conflict. The citizens knew the world was changing, and the reality of slavery's eventual collapse was becoming inevitable. And for men like Elijah Anderson, this collapse was more than just a distant political issue, it was a matter of survival and, ultimately, freedom. Born into bondage in the early 1820s, Elijah Anderson had a remarkable mind. He was born to a family of enslaved African Americans on a large estate that had once been owned by wealthy landowners who were part of the region's elite. However, despite the harshness of his upbringing, Anderson exhibited qualities that set him apart from many other enslaved individuals of his time. His intelligence and natural leadership abilities did not go unnoticed, even by his masters. But it was his compassion and deep sense of justice that would shape his legacy in ways that no one could have foreseen. From an early age, Anderson developed a desire to help other enslaved people. His experiences working in the fields and witnessing the cruelty of slavery inspired him to seek out ways to resist. He began to form connections with free black men and abolitionists, and by his early 20s, he had become a well-known figure in Kentucky's underground movement to free enslaved people. Though he was not yet fully liberated himself, Anderson's ability to communicate with both black and white abolitionists earned him respect among those fighting for freedom. It was said that he had a way of speaking that captivated audiences, whether they were fellow slaves or powerful political figures. In the close-knit communities of Kentucky, word of his efforts spread like wildfire. The town of Anderson's birth, however, did not share the same enthusiasm for abolitionism. It was a place deeply entrenched in the old ways of thinking, where slavery was considered vital to the local economy, and the idea of emancipation seemed more like a distant dream than a practical reality. While some members of the community quietly supported the abolitionist cause, the vast majority were either ambivalent or openly hostile toward it. They were the ones who had everything to lose if slavery were abolished. To them, Elijah Anderson's ideas were dangerous, not just politically, but existentially. His potential for leadership among enslaved people, his drive for freedom, and his intellectual prowess threatened the very foundation of their livelihoods. His name, if allowed to spread too far, could inspire others to rise up against the established order. And so, there were whispers in the town that something needed to be done about this man. Despite the looming danger, Anderson did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, he pressed forward with his mission, advocating for the freedom of others while seeking to free himself. His presence in Kentucky's abolitionist circles was not only known but revered. In the early 1840s, a small group of abolitionists arranged for Anderson's escape, sending him northward along the Underground Railroad. For a time, it appeared that Anderson had found the freedom he had long sought. But even as he entered the North and became involved in the broader abolitionist movement, the echoes of his past in Kentucky never ceased to follow him. His enemies were not content to let him go that easily. And in a place where history could be shaped as easily as a political victory was won, his story would not remain untouched. In the years following his escape, Anderson's efforts were increasingly recognized, though there was little public acknowledgement of his contributions. As the abolitionist movement gained ground, some began to recall the daring black men and women who had fought for freedom. Anderson's name appeared sporadically in journals and pamphlets, though he was always overshadowed by the more famous figures of the movement, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. His work as a leader within the abolitionist circles of Kentucky, where he had helped organize efforts to free enslaved people, seemed to go unmentioned in most historical records. But it was in the town of his birth that Anderson's true erasure began. As the nation moved toward the Civil War, Kentucky remained a border state, torn between Union and Confederate loyalties. Although the state officially remained in the Union, its support for the Confederacy was strong, and many of its citizens were ardently pro-slavery. These sentiments were especially powerful in the more rural regions, where the economic structure still relied heavily on agriculture and slavery. Anderson, a living example of what an enslaved person could achieve if given the chance, was viewed as an existential threat to these ideals. By the time the Civil War had ended and slavery was abolished, the political climate had shifted. Emancipation had brought freedom to many, but it had also exposed the deep divisions within the country, especially in places like Kentucky, where many still clung to the old ways. In the wake of the war, Anderson's name began to vanish from the historical records. His contribution to the abolitionist movement and his role in freeing others became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger narrative that focused on the broad political and military figures of the time. Yet, within the town itself, a more insidious erasure was taking place. In Kentucky, as across much of the South, the memory of black people who had played significant roles in the fight for freedom was systematically erased. Local leaders sought to suppress the story of Elijah Anderson because it was one that threatened the prevailing narrative of post-Civil War America. His life, his courage, and his leadership stood in direct opposition to the version of history that was being written, one that sought to minimize the role of enslaved people in the fight for freedom. The history that was taught in schools and memorialized in local monuments would not include figures like Anderson, people who had lived, fought, and died for a cause that was uncomfortable to confront. For decades, the erasure of Elijah Anderson's name continued unabated. His story was overshadowed by those whose voices were more politically palatable to the establishment. His achievements were lost in the noise of Reconstruction and the subsequent push for the lost cause narrative, which minimized the role of enslaved people and their contributions to the fight for freedom. It was as though Anderson's life had never happened, and with each passing year, his existence slipped further and further into the shadows. His name, once known to many, became nothing more than a whisper, a name with no face, a legacy that could not be found. Yet, despite the silence, the town of Anderson's birth still held the key to his story. There were those who remembered the man who had defied the odds, who had stood up against the darkness of slavery, and who had given everything to bring others to freedom. But those memories were fading, and the town itself, once alive with the energy of the abolitionist movement, had grown quiet, its streets empty and its history buried under layers of forgotten struggles. The town's isolation, both physical and cultural, mirrored the isolation of Anderson's memory, as if history itself had conspired to forget him. But buried in this forgotten place, amid the overgrown streets and the dilapidated buildings, the investigator knew that the truth about Elijah Anderson still lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. And, perhaps, at long last, the erasure of his name could be reversed. Elijah Anderson's life, as remarkable as it was, didn't just vanish because of the passage of time or the lack of documentation, it was actively erased. His story was not one of gradual neglect, where his name simply faded into obscurity, rather, it was a calculated erasure, a deliberate attempt to remove him from the collective memory of the American people. And the more the investigator uncovered about his life, the more it became clear that Anderson's name had been systematically scrubbed from the historical record. But why? Why would someone who had been an active force for change, a man who had fought for freedom not only for himself but for others, be erased so thoroughly? The first clue came when the investigator stumbled upon a cryptic letter in the town's faded archives, a letter that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. It was a letter written by a local abolitionist, someone who had worked alongside Anderson in Kentucky during the early years of the abolitionist movement. The letter spoke of a man of exceptional character, someone who had been deeply involved in efforts to free enslaved people, but it also made a startling admission: Anderson's name had been actively removed from all public records. The writer of the letter suggested that the local authorities, figures who were likely aligned with the plantation elite, had made it clear that Anderson's legacy could not be allowed to persist. The letter concluded with a haunting remark: "His spirit is too dangerous for us to allow it to remain in the world of the living." This chilling statement made it apparent that Elijah Anderson's erasure was not an accident, it was a direct attack on his memory, an attempt to bury the story of a man who had the potential to change the course of history. It was an early sign that the town itself, and perhaps even the broader state of Kentucky, had a vested interest in keeping Anderson's life, his story, and his efforts for freedom out of the public eye. The authorities who controlled the town's records had seen the influence Anderson could have on the enslaved and freed black population, and they sought to suppress him in the same way they had sought to suppress the voices of many others who fought for abolition. Further investigation led the researcher to other old documents, diaries, journals, and even some family records, detailing Anderson's work in the community. These records were, however, inconsistently preserved. There were gaps, moments where entire pages were torn out, sections of text that had been redacted or erased. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one could piece together the full extent of Anderson's impact. One particularly damning letter from a local politician to a Kentucky senator indicated that the man had been too vocal and too influential, and that there were concerns about the fate of the region if Anderson's influence were allowed to grow. The letter also described how Anderson's name had been intentionally left out of key petitions, historical documents, and accounts of local events, all in an effort to remove him from the narrative of emancipation and freedom. At first glance, it might seem inconceivable that someone would go to such lengths to erase a single individual from history, but as the investigator pieced the puzzle together, the reasons for this extreme measure became clearer. Elijah Anderson had become a symbol, not just of individual resistance but of a broader, more dangerous movement, the fight for freedom that transcended personal boundaries and reached into the very heart of a nation's moral dilemma. His ability to inspire others, his role in organizing escape routes for enslaved people, and his influence within both black and white abolitionist circles made him a powerful figure, one whose legacy could not be allowed to endure. If his story were allowed to persist, it would have to challenge the dominant narratives of race, freedom, and slavery that many in Kentucky, and the larger southern states, wanted to protect at all costs. As the investigation dug deeper, it became clear that Anderson's erasure wasn't confined solely to the destruction of documents or the withholding of information. The people who had known him, the few remaining eyewitnesses to his life and actions, had been silenced in other ways. Some of them had been threatened or coerced into silence, others had simply been forgotten, their own names erased along with Anderson's. There were whispers in the town, fragments of stories passed down through generations, stories about how the town's elders had worked to bury the truth, how they had silenced anyone who might speak in favor of Anderson's contributions. Over the years, it became apparent that the very structure of the town's memory had been altered to fit the narrative that those in power wanted to maintain. One of the most troubling revelations came from the local cemetery. The gravestones in the old burial ground, which had once marked the resting places of many prominent local figures, told a different story, one that had been carefully constructed to erase all traces of those who had been a part of the abolitionist movement. Elijah Anderson's name was not among the headstones, nor was there any mention of him in the records of burials that had been maintained by the church. In fact, when researchers attempted to find any trace of his burial site, they found only a single, cryptic marker that had been placed at the edge of the cemetery, hidden away from the more visible gravestones. It was as if someone had intentionally placed it there to keep it out of sight, an eerie, shadowy reminder that even in death, Anderson's memory was to be buried. The mystery of Anderson's erasure seemed to grow more profound with every new discovery. In conversations with local elders, some of whom had ancestors who had lived through the Civil War era, a common thread emerged: Anderson's memory had been deliberately suppressed to preserve the myth of the benign South. This myth, which had taken root in Kentucky and across much of the South, painted a picture of a genteel, agrarian society that had been devastated by war and had ultimately sought reconciliation with the North. In this narrative, the role of black people in achieving their own freedom was minimized, and those who had played a key role in the abolition movement were often forgotten or vilified. Anderson, as a figure who had fought for the freedom of both himself and others, could not fit into this carefully constructed narrative. His story had to be erased to maintain the illusion of a more palatable, post-war South. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that Anderson's erasure had broader implications for the history of Kentucky itself. It was not just one man's story that had been buried, but an entire chapter of the struggle for freedom. The story of Anderson's life, and his eventual disappearance from the record, became symbolic of the larger cultural and political forces at work in the post-war South. It was an attempt to suppress not just a person, but an entire history of resistance, of defiance, and of hope. The erasure of Anderson was part of a larger pattern in which the struggles of black people for freedom were systematically ignored or rewritten to fit the narrative of a society that could not bear to confront the truth of its own complicity. But there were still some who remembered. Small remnants of his story remained embedded in the town's collective memory. The investigator spoke with descendants of the few families who had known Anderson, some of whom had never been told the full extent of his contributions but who had heard fragments of his story from their ancestors. These individuals were not content to let Anderson's legacy disappear completely, even if they didn't fully understand the weight of what had been erased. But for each story told, there seemed to be another part of the puzzle that had been hidden from view. And so, the mystery of Elijah Anderson's erasure deepened, leaving the investigator with an unsettling sense that some truths might never be fully uncovered. But the more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Anderson's story, however obscured, was too important to be left in the past. It was a story that needed to be told, if not for the sake of the past, then for the sake of the future. As the investigation continued, the question shifted from, what happened to Elijah Anderson, to, what was the cost of erasing his story, and what does it say about the world that allowed it to happen? As the investigation into Elijah Anderson's life deepened, the next layer of the mystery began to unfold. The few witnesses who still held fragments of his story, whether through memory, family accounts, or historical snippets, had been reduced to mere whispers, voices trembling as they tried to recount a tale that had been largely silenced. The town's historical erasure of Anderson's legacy had not only affected the written records, but also the collective memory of the community itself. But despite the silence, the investigator discovered there were still remnants, small pieces of the puzzle, scattered among the locals who could remember a man whose very name had been overshadowed by time and fear. The first person to speak on the matter was Miss Dorothy Jenkins, a local historian in her late 70s, who had spent decades researching the Civil War era in Kentucky. She was hesitant to speak at first, aware of the sensitive nature of the topic and the long-standing reluctance of the town to discuss anything related to the abolitionist movement. She'd heard the stories, of course, but only in passing, in hushed conversations between the older generations. And yet, something about Elijah Anderson's name had always haunted her. She explained that she had grown up hearing strange tales from her grandmother, who was a child during the Reconstruction era. The older woman had always mentioned a revolutionary figure, who had lived in the area, someone who had stirred the pot and brought hope to the hopeless. But, Miss Jenkins admitted, it was only when she began to dig into the town's records that she realized Anderson's name was entirely absent. She found references to abolitionists, to freedmen, and even to the Union Army, but Anderson's contributions were nowhere to be found. Her discovery mirrored the initial findings of the investigator, confirming that Anderson's erasure wasn't just an oversight, it was deliberate. She recounted how, when she was younger, her grandmother had spoken in fragmented sentences about a man of promise who had vanished after the war, as though the act of remembering him was too dangerous for the living to do. But Miss Jenkins was not the only account. Elijah Anderson's name appeared again in the memory of George Watkins, a retired carpenter whose family had lived in the area for generations. Watkins, in his early years, had grown up hearing stories from his mother about the years following the Civil War, when many black families had worked together in secret to escape their enslaved lives. His mother, a descendant of freedmen, spoke often about a figure who had helped lead people to freedom, a man whose name was barely whispered in public but who was revered in private circles. Watkins, now an elderly man, had never understood the significance of these stories until he began to hear the same name, Elijah Anderson, in his research. As a child, Watkins had been told by his elders that Anderson was a man who had been too good for this world, a man whose spirit, his resolve, and his leadership had been too dangerous for the powers that controlled the town's future. In his youth, he thought of these stories as local folklore, exaggerated by time and generations of passing down tales. Now, though, as an adult, he understood the weight of those stories, particularly when he stumbled upon a missing journal of Anderson's from a distant relative who had witnessed his efforts firsthand. This journal had been locked away for years, hidden from public view. It confirmed what Watkins had long suspected: Anderson had been a central figure in the Underground Railroad, helping to coordinate escapes and strategizing how to protect those who sought freedom. The most chilling part, however, was the final page of the journal, which simply read, "And then he vanished." No one knew where he went. No one dared to ask. Watkins' recollection was even more haunting when he shared a detail that had often been overlooked by others: Anderson's connection to a network of black churches that had formed the backbone of the abolitionist movement in Kentucky. In a region steeped in religious tradition, black churches were pivotal in organizing movements to resist slavery. But the churches, too, had played a darker role in the erasure of Anderson. They had, at one point, been the place where Anderson's efforts were documented and celebrated. Some local preachers had even praised his leadership and courage. But when the threat of federal intervention and the growing fear of black-led uprisings became too great for the town's white elite, those same churches suddenly grew quiet about Anderson's efforts. Local religious leaders who had once been outspoken in their support of abolition and freedom were now pressed into silence, their voices smothered by the threat of retaliation from powerful figures in Kentucky. The church that had once championed Anderson now refused to acknowledge his contributions, and members of the congregation were discouraged from speaking his name aloud. What had begun as a symbol of hope and unity had turned into a dangerous political liability, and so Anderson's involvement in those movements was erased from the church's official history. As the investigators' search for witnesses continued, the fragments of Anderson's story began to form a clearer picture of the kind of man he had been. He was not just an abolitionist, he was a leader who had sought to create a community of mutual aid, a sanctuary for those escaping the horrors of enslavement. He worked with freedmen, former slaves, and white abolitionists, bridging divides that others had deemed impossible. But the deeper the investigator dug into the history of this community, the more it became apparent that the town's leaders had not only silenced Anderson but had actively worked to erase his legacy from the minds of their children and grandchildren. The mystery of Anderson's disappearance was not a random act of fate, it was the culmination of a strategic campaign to bury a figure who, if remembered, could serve as a living testament to the power of resistance. One of the most curious aspects of the investigation was the pattern of misinformation and gaslighting surrounding Anderson's life. As more interviews were conducted, the investigator encountered individuals who had grown up with partial knowledge of Anderson, but whose memories had been shaped by half-truths and distortions. People had been conditioned to believe that Anderson was either a myth or, at best, an exaggeration, a local hero whose story had been blown out of proportion by those seeking to elevate their own legacies. The story of his heroism was reduced to a kind of folklore, relegated to the realm of local legend, rather than being acknowledged as a factual part of the abolitionist movement in Kentucky. Anderson's role in the Underground Railroad, his work with the black churches, and his personal story of overcoming the brutalities of slavery were buried under a cloud of doubt. The more the investigator uncovered, the more the fear of Anderson's memory persisted. Those who might have known him, who might have carried on his story, were either silenced by fear or simply unaware of the weight of what they held in their hands. The few remaining records, often incomplete and unreliable, pointed to the fact that Anderson's existence had been purposefully obscured by those who had lived in fear of his influence. However, the most striking element of this ongoing mystery was the way the townspeople, both black and white, had come to accept this erasure. They had been conditioned, over decades, to believe that Anderson's contributions to the abolitionist cause were either exaggerated or non-existent. By the time the investigator reached the final stages of his search, the town had largely moved on from the past. The physical structures that had once borne witness to Anderson's life and struggle had decayed, and the individuals who might have had first-hand knowledge of him had either passed away or were too old to speak clearly. The legacy of Anderson, which had once seemed so vital and alive, had become a ghost, an echo of a past that no longer seemed to matter. But the chilling reality of Anderson's erasure was that it was not just an isolated incident. His story was not the only one to be silenced in this way. In fact, the investigators' findings hinted at a larger pattern of historical revisionism across Kentucky, where figures like Anderson, black abolitionists, leaders, and freedom fighters, had been systematically removed from the public memory. What was happening to Anderson was part of a broader attempt to control the narrative of the South's history and to sanitize the violent, oppressive nature of its past. The witness testimonies, now fading into the margins of time, spoke of a much darker truth, that Anderson's erasure was not just about him. It was about an entire history that had been whitewashed and forgotten, a history of struggle and survival that had been buried to protect the reputation of those who had never truly been interested in reconciliation, only in maintaining their power. And as the investigator pondered the full weight of these revelations, the question remained unanswered: would Elijah Anderson's true legacy ever be allowed to emerge from the shadows, or would it remain forever buried in the fog of history? The investigation into Elijah Anderson's life had brought the researcher deeper into a web of mystery that spanned not just the years of his life, but the decades that followed, extending even to the present day. It was one thing to discover that Anderson's name had been erased from historical records, but it was another to confront the deep psychological and cultural impact that his erasure had on the town itself. The question wasn't just why Anderson had been erased, it was also why the very idea of his legacy had been so thoroughly suppressed, to the point where even the people who should have remembered him had been convinced to forget. As the investigator continued to dig into the local archives, it became clear that the historical erasure of Anderson was a deliberate attempt to manipulate the collective memory of the community. The absence of his name in town records and the subsequent dismissal of any mention of him in public discussions were not simply the result of poor record-keeping. There had been a concerted effort to create a version of history that would align more comfortably with the post-war narrative of Kentucky and, more broadly, the South. In the aftermath of the Civil War, when slavery had been abolished and the Confederacy had been defeated, the state of Kentucky had faced a moral reckoning. But instead of grappling with the full implications of slavery, the state chose to focus on a more palatable version of its past, one that would allow for the continued dominance of those who had historically held power. This was where the erasure of Elijah Anderson played a critical role. Anderson had been a vocal advocate for freedom, justice, and equality. His life, and the stories of his bravery in the face of adversity, presented a challenge to the sanitized version of history that Kentucky wanted to preserve. If Anderson's story had been allowed to stand, it would have exposed the contradiction at the heart of Kentucky's post-war identity, a state that claimed to be loyal to the Union while still holding on to the deeply entrenched racial prejudices that had allowed slavery to thrive. The state, in its efforts to reconcile its past, could not afford to acknowledge figures like Anderson, black men who had fought for their freedom and had become symbols of resistance. To do so would have forced Kentucky to confront the uncomfortable reality that, for much of its history, it had been complicit in one of the greatest moral atrocities the world had ever known. The most striking aspect of this historical distortion was the way it was institutionalized. Kentucky's schools, its newspapers, and even its local churches had all played a role in perpetuating a version of history that minimized the contributions of black individuals like Elijah Anderson. The town itself, once a place where Anderson had been known for his work as an abolitionist and a leader, now seemed to deliberately ignore the very fact of his existence. His name was scarcely mentioned in local histories, and when it was often misrepresented or dismissed as an anomaly. His legacy was reduced to a footnote in the larger narrative of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, if it was mentioned at all. This was not just an accident of history. The forces behind this erasure understood the power of storytelling. They knew that the stories we tell about our past shape our understanding of who we are. And so, they made a deliberate choice to create a version of history that would protect their own interests. By suppressing the stories of black resistance, by erasing figures like Elijah Anderson, they were able to maintain a sense of continuity and order, even in the wake of the destruction wrought by the Civil War. But while the town had done its best to suppress Anderson's legacy, the cracks in their carefully constructed narrative were beginning to show. The investigators' search had uncovered a trail of whispers, forgotten documents, and hidden memories, all of which pointed back to the man who had once been a symbol of hope and defiance in a land that had long resisted change. Anderson's story was not easily forgotten, and even though the forces of suppression had done their best to silence it, his memory still lingered in the most unexpected places. One of the most significant discoveries came when the investigator found a series of old family letters that had been passed down through generations. These letters, written by relatives of local families who had known Anderson personally, revealed the deep emotional and psychological impact of his erasure. In one particularly moving letter, a family member described how Anderson had helped them escape slavery and start a new life in the North. The letter expressed not only gratitude but also a profound sense of loss, the loss of a hero, a leader, and a friend who had been forgotten by history. It was clear from these letters that Anderson's erasure had left a lasting scar on those who had known him. For many, the disappearance of his name was not just a historical curiosity, it was a deeply personal wound. But it wasn't just the people who had known Anderson directly who had been affected. The psychological toll of the erasure had reverberated throughout the community, shaping the collective identity of the town for generations. By denying the existence of men like Anderson, the town had forced its residents to forget the most important truths about their own history. They had been made to feel that their own personal and collective stories were unimportant, that their experiences were nothing more than footnotes in a larger narrative that had already been written. The effect of this denial was subtle, yet profound. It created a culture of silence, one in which difficult questions about race, justice, and freedom were avoided, and where the painful legacies of slavery and oppression were left unaddressed. The erasure of Anderson's story also had broader implications for the understanding of the Civil War and its aftermath. By removing figures like Anderson from the historical record, Kentucky had effectively rewritten the history of the abolitionist movement in the region. The narrative that emerged was one that emphasized the heroism of the Union Army and the moral righteousness of emancipation, while downplaying the role of black resistance in achieving freedom. Anderson's life, with all its complexities, represented a challenge to that narrative. His story was not one of passive victimhood, it was one of active resistance, of struggle, and of triumph over adversity. If his name had been allowed to persist, it would have been a powerful reminder of the agency and strength of black Americans in the fight for their own freedom. But even as the town had sought to suppress Anderson's legacy, it had not entirely succeeded. As the investigation progressed, more and more people began to recall fragments of his story, bits and pieces that had been hidden away, either out of fear or out of ignorance. The investigator spoke to descendants of those who had known Anderson, some of whom had never been told the full extent of his contributions but who had heard stories from their ancestors. The discovery of these pieces of Anderson's life, scattered across the community, suggested that the efforts to erase him were far from complete. There was a sense, too, that the more the town tried to bury Anderson's memory, the more it seemed to resist being forgotten. The silence surrounding his life had become an open wound, one that could no longer be ignored. As the investigator connected the dots, it became increasingly clear that Anderson's story was not merely a relic of the past, it was a living, breathing testament to the fight for freedom, and it demanded to be heard. Even the town, in all its efforts to rewrite history, could not entirely suppress the power of his legacy. The emotional cost of this erasure, however, was not just felt by those who had known Anderson. It rippled through the generations that followed, leaving a community struggling with an incomplete understanding of its own history. The psychological scars left by the deliberate denial of the contributions of black men and women in the fight for freedom were deep and enduring. The people of the town, shaped by this silence, were forced to live with the knowledge that they had been part of a system that had sought to bury the truth, to rewrite the past, and to make heroes like Elijah Anderson disappear. But in the end, the investigation had uncovered something more important than the simple truth of what had happened to Anderson. It had revealed the enduring power of memory, the way in which history, even when it is buried, has a way of rising to the surface. Anderson's story, though hidden for so long, had refused to stay forgotten. And as long as there were those who remembered, those who were willing to speak his name, his legacy would continue to live on, no matter how hard some tried to erase it. The investigator, with each new revelation, had come to understand that the story of Elijah Anderson was not just about one man. It was about a larger struggle, a struggle for justice, for memory, and for the right to be remembered in the face of those who would seek to erase history. As the investigation into Elijah Anderson's life continued to unfold, the chilling reality of his erasure began to take on even greater significance. With each new discovery, the investigators' understanding of the broader implications of Anderson's disappearance deepened. It was no longer just a personal story of one man's forgotten legacy, it was a reflection of a system of historical suppression, a larger pattern that mirrored the struggles faced by countless other black abolitionists and freedom fighters whose names had been intentionally erased from the annals of American history. The more the investigator uncovered, the clearer it became that Elijah Anderson's erasure was not a singular, isolated case, it was emblematic of a national effort to silence the contributions of black people in the fight for freedom. The history of Kentucky, especially in the post-Civil War period, had been deeply marked by this systematic erasure. The state, though technically a Union state, had been a battleground of conflicting ideologies during the war, caught between the loyalties of those who supported the Confederacy and those who fought for the Union cause. In this volatile environment, Kentucky's identity had been shaped by a deeply entrenched belief in white supremacy, even in the face of the Union's victory. For many in Kentucky, the abolition of slavery was not seen as a triumph, but rather as a loss of a system that had supported the state's agricultural economy and way of life for generations. The idea of freedom for black people was a deeply uncomfortable concept, one that threatened the power structures that had been built on the backs of enslaved labor. In this context, the story of Elijah Anderson was a threat. He was not simply an abolitionist, he was a symbol of defiance, of resistance to the status quo, and a living testament to the fact that black people had not only fought for their own freedom, but had played an integral role in dismantling the institution of slavery itself. His efforts were a direct challenge to the dominant narrative that sought to downplay the role of black people in the abolitionist movement, and to elevate the contributions of white abolitionists and Union soldiers while erasing the active participation of black men and women in that struggle. Anderson's legacy, if allowed to survive, would force Kentucky, and the South as a whole, to confront uncomfortable truths about its past. The psychological impact of Anderson's erasure was not limited to the town where he had lived and worked. It rippled outward, affecting the larger narrative of the post-war South and the national conversation about race, justice, and memory. The denial of Anderson's story was part of a broader effort to shape the way Americans thought about the Civil War and its aftermath. By erasing the stories of black abolitionists like Anderson, the state of Kentucky, and, by extension, the country, could continue to perpetuate the myth of the benevolent South, where slavery had been a benign institution that had only been destroyed by the actions of noble white Union soldiers. This narrative minimized the role of black people in their own liberation, suggesting that they were passive victims of an evil system rather than active agents of change. This rewriting of history had long-lasting effects on the way black people were viewed in the post-war period. It fostered a culture of silence around the contributions of black abolitionists and freedom fighters, making it more difficult for future generations to understand the full scope of their struggle. By suppressing the stories of people like Elijah Anderson, the country was also suppressing the possibility of a more just and inclusive future. The message was clear: black people's contributions to the fight for freedom were secondary to the narrative of white heroism, and their stories could be conveniently forgotten when they no longer fit the dominant narrative. The erasure of Anderson's legacy was also a reminder of the deep divisions that remained within the country, particularly in the South. Despite the formal end of slavery, the region was still deeply entrenched in racial inequality. Kentucky, like many Southern states, passed black codes and other forms of legal discrimination that kept African Americans in a subordinate position. The idea of black people being recognized as leaders in the fight for freedom was a direct threat to the political and social order that had been established after the war. This fear of black empowerment was not just a relic of the pre-war South, it continued to haunt the nation during Reconstruction and beyond. In this context, the deliberate erasure of figures like Anderson was not just an attempt to suppress history, it was an attempt to maintain control over the present and the future. One of the most striking aspects of the investigation was the realization that the suppression of Anderson's memory had been so successful that even the most well-meaning individuals in the town had been complicit in the erasure. As the researchers spoke to more and more locals, it became evident that the town's collective amnesia was not born from malice, but from decades of cultural conditioning. The stories of black abolitionists and freedom fighters had been systematically excluded from the education system, from local celebrations, and from the public consciousness. This silence had become so ingrained that even those who might have been sympathetic to Anderson's cause had internalized the idea that his story wasn't worth telling. In many ways, this was the most insidious part of Anderson's erasure, the way it had become normalized, the way that entire generations of people had come to accept the absence of his story without question. This was not simply a case of historical oversight, it was a cultural mechanism that had been designed to keep the painful truths of slavery and its legacy buried. Anderson's name had been erased from the records, but so too had the idea that black people had the right to define their own history, to shape their own legacy. The effect of this was far-reaching. It meant that, for generations, black people in Kentucky, and in the South more broadly, had been deprived of the knowledge of their own heroes. They had been denied the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the story of their own liberation. The erasure of Anderson was also a direct consequence of the way that American history had been taught in the decades following the Civil War. History, in many ways, had been written by those who had the power to control the narrative. In Kentucky, this meant that the history of slavery, the abolition movement, and the Civil War was often framed in ways that minimized the role of black people in shaping their own destinies. The state's education system, its textbooks, and its public monuments all reinforced the idea that the struggle for freedom was something that had been imposed upon black people by white abolitionists and Union soldiers. Figures like Elijah Anderson, who had fought for freedom on their own terms, had been marginalized and erased from the record because their stories did not fit the dominant narrative. The psychological toll of this erasure was profound, especially for those who had grown up in Kentucky and had been taught to view the Civil War and its aftermath through a lens that ignored or minimized the role of black people in their own liberation. For generations, the people of Kentucky had lived with a distorted understanding of their own history, one that excluded the stories of resistance and defiance that had been central to the black experience in the South. The impact of this denial was not just historical, it was psychological, emotional, and cultural. By erasing figures like Elijah Anderson, the state had reinforced the idea that black people's contributions to the nation's history were secondary, that their struggles were not worth remembering, and that their voices had no place in the national conversation. The more the investigator uncovered, the more it became apparent that Elijah Anderson's erasure was not just about one man, it was about the larger struggle for justice and recognition that continued to haunt the American landscape. Anderson's life and legacy were inextricably tied to the fight for freedom, not just for himself but for generations of black Americans who had fought for their right to exist as free people. His story, though suppressed for so long, had begun to rise to the surface once again, and as it did, it became clear that the truth of his life would not be easily buried. His legacy, long hidden, was slowly being reclaimed by those who remembered him, not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of resilience, resistance, and the enduring struggle for justice. The investigation had revealed that even in the face of powerful forces seeking to erase his memory, Elijah Anderson's story was one that could never be truly forgotten. As the investigation into the erasure of Elijah Anderson's name continued, it became evident that the story of his life wasn't just about one man's disappearance from history, it was about the battle between truth and myth, memory and erasure. The deeper the investigator delved, the more they realized that Anderson's life and legacy were intimately tied to larger questions about race, history, and power. Anderson had been a figure who fought not only for his own freedom, but for the freedom of others, challenging the dominant narratives about slavery and the abolitionist movement. His contributions, however, had been actively suppressed for decades, erased from official records, removed from public consciousness, and overshadowed by forces that had much to gain from keeping his story hidden. But as the investigation unfolded, another layer of the mystery began to emerge. The persistent efforts to discredit and dismiss Anderson's role in the abolitionist movement were not just a product of personal or local animosity. The erasure of his name was part of a much larger and more systematic process of historical revisionism, one that was deeply entrenched in the very fabric of Kentucky's post-war identity and, more broadly, in the South's struggle to reconcile with its past. The local suppression of Anderson's story was not just about one individual, it was about the larger question of how history was told, who got to write it, and who was allowed to be remembered. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Kentucky found itself in a precarious position. Although it was officially a Union state, it had deep ties to the South and had long been a place where slavery and racial hierarchies were deeply embedded in society. The end of slavery meant a dramatic shift in the political, economic, and social landscape of the state, and many in Kentucky were unwilling to confront the full implications of emancipation. In particular, the question of how to remember the role of black people in the fight for freedom was fraught with tension. Many in Kentucky, particularly among the ruling white elite, sought to downplay the importance of black abolitionists, their contributions, and their struggles, in favor of a narrative that painted the South in a more favorable light. This narrative depicted the end of slavery as a tragedy, a loss to the way of life that had defined the South for centuries, and it often omitted or minimized the active role that black people, like Anderson, had played in their own liberation. This process of historical revisionism didn't just happen overnight. It was the product of decades of careful manipulation, by politicians, educators, and influential local families, who sought to shape the way that future generations understood the past. The aim was not just to gloss over the painful history of slavery but to erase the memory of those who had fought against it. This was particularly true for figures like Anderson, whose story threatened to upset the carefully constructed narrative of a benign South. Anderson's role in the abolitionist movement, his active defiance of the system that had enslaved him, and his efforts to help others escape to freedom were all anathema to the mythology that many in Kentucky and the South sought to preserve. One of the most disturbing discoveries in the investigation was the realization that Anderson's erasure had been not just a historical oversight, but an organized campaign that had persisted into the 20th century. Even as the civil rights movement began to gain traction in the mid-20th century, Anderson's name was rarely mentioned in the renewed conversations about race and justice. Schools in Kentucky taught the history of the Civil War and its aftermath, but they often glossed over the role of black activists and abolitionists, focusing instead on the actions of white leaders and military figures. In these classrooms, Elijah Anderson's name was never spoken. He was neither celebrated as a hero nor condemned as a villain. He was simply absent. The more the investigator learned about Anderson's disappearance from history, the clearer it became that his erasure was not an isolated case. Figures like Anderson were systematically wiped from the historical record because their stories presented a threat to the status quo. The leaders who controlled Kentucky's historical narrative wanted to maintain a version of the past that minimized the role of black people in shaping the future of the nation. To allow someone like Anderson, an outspoken black man who had led others to freedom, to be remembered, would have forced Kentucky to confront the uncomfortable reality that slavery was not just an isolated, morally indefensible institution, but one that had been supported by the state's very structure. And so, figures like Anderson were written out of the history books, their stories dismissed or ignored. However, as the investigation continued, it became clear that this erasure was not entirely successful. The very fact that Anderson's story was still being uncovered, piece by piece, through old letters, fragmented diaries, and the fading memories of those who had known him, was proof that the truth had never been fully buried. There were still those in the community who remembered the work Anderson had done, who recognized his contributions, and who understood the vital role he had played in Kentucky's history. These individuals, though few in number, were the key to bringing Anderson's story back into the light. In particular, the investigation uncovered a network of local activists and scholars who had long known about Anderson's contributions but had been too intimidated or disillusioned to speak out. These people had spent years quietly pushing for a reassessment of Kentucky's historical narrative, fighting for the inclusion of black abolitionists and freedom fighters in the town's public memory. They had often been met with resistance, particularly from those who were invested in maintaining the status quo, but their efforts had begun to gain traction. As the researcher spoke with more people who had worked alongside these activists, it became apparent that the tide was slowly shifting. While there were still powerful forces in Kentucky that sought to silence the truth, there was a growing movement to reclaim lost histories and give a voice to those who had been erased. One of the most powerful moments in the investigation came when the researcher uncovered a letter from a prominent black historian who had been working in Kentucky during the 1960s. The letter, written to a local newspaper editor, detailed the historian's efforts to promote the memory of Elijah Anderson and other black abolitionists, despite the overwhelming resistance they faced. The historian described how, in the face of widespread indifference and hostility, they had managed to convince a local school to dedicate a small plaque to Anderson's memory. The plaque, though modest, marked a significant step toward acknowledging Anderson's contributions. It was a small victory in a larger, ongoing battle for recognition, but it showed that, even in the face of great adversity, there were those who refused to let Anderson's name fade into obscurity. Despite these efforts, however, the historian's letter also revealed the tremendous challenges that still remained. The battle for historical recognition was not just about reclaiming names and dates, it was about fighting for a more truthful and inclusive understanding of the past, one that acknowledged the pain, the struggle, and the triumphs of those who had been marginalized. The historian's letter ended with a sobering realization: while progress had been made, the full story of Elijah Anderson's life, and the lives of so many others like him, had not yet been told. The historian closed with the words, "We will continue to fight, not just for history's sake, but for the sake of those who come after us, so that they may know the truth." As the investigator sat back and reflected on all they had uncovered, it was clear that Elijah Anderson's story was far from over. Despite the decades of suppression, despite the forces that had worked so tirelessly to erase his name, Anderson's legacy was beginning to re-emerge. The question was no longer whether his memory would survive, but how long it would take for the truth to finally be acknowledged. And as the researcher continued their work, they understood that the investigation itself was part of a larger movement, a movement to reclaim history, to correct the omissions, and to restore the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. The battle for the truth of Elijah Anderson's life, and for the broader history of black abolitionists, was not one that could be won in a single moment. It would take time, effort, and the collective will of those who refused to let the past be rewritten. But as the story of Elijah Anderson's erasure began to unravel, it was clear that the forces that had sought to silence him were losing their grip. The truth, as it always does, was beginning to find its way to the surface. And when it did, it would shake the foundations of the history that had been built on lies. Elijah Anderson's name would not be erased forever. His legacy would endure. The final stages of the investigation into the disappearance of Elijah Anderson from the historical record led the researcher down a path that revealed both the power of memory and the lingering shadow of fear. As Anderson's story slowly pieced together, it became clear that the erasure of his name was not just a function of time or circumstance, it was a strategic decision rooted in the social, political, and racial dynamics of post-Civil War Kentucky. The deeper the investigation went, the more it uncovered the psychological impact of this historical disappearance, not just on the people who had known Anderson, but on the entire community. The ghosts of the past were not merely fading into oblivion, they were still present, shaping the lives of those who had lived through the turmoil of a fractured society. With each new lead, the investigator uncovered more startling revelations about how Anderson's contributions to the abolitionist movement were buried under layers of historical distortion. What had begun as a search for the truth of one man's life was now entangled in the larger question of how society, particularly Southern society, grapples with its own demons. Anderson had not only been erased from history, his existence had been completely obscured by the dominant narratives of the time. The full scale of the systemic effort to suppress his memory became apparent as the investigation moved toward its final phase. As Anderson's legacy continued to be disregarded and overlooked, his absence was not just a matter of historical omission, it was a psychological scar that left the town struggling with the uneasy tension between its past and its present. One of the most critical discoveries made in this section of the investigation was the realization that Anderson's erasure was a direct response to the post-war ideological battles that took place throughout Kentucky and the South. After the Civil War, many Southern states were left in a moral and political limbo, their economies shattered, and their societal structures in disarray. The era that followed, Reconstruction, was an attempt at rebuilding the South, but also an effort to preserve the existing power dynamics that had been upended by the war. It was during this time that the forces of white supremacy sought to regain control and reassert their dominance, using every tool at their disposal, political, economic, and social, to maintain the status quo. For many white Southerners, the existence of men like Elijah Anderson, black abolitionists who had actively worked against the institution of slavery, was a direct threat to the new social order. To acknowledge Anderson's contributions would have meant acknowledging the profound power and agency of black people in their own fight for freedom, something that was in direct opposition to the dominant narrative of white benevolence and the heroism of Union soldiers. Kentucky, in particular, was deeply invested in preserving this myth. By erasing figures like Anderson, the state could continue to sell the idea that the South's loss was simply the result of a tragic, misguided war rather than the collapse of a morally indefensible institution. Figures like Anderson, who had fought for freedom on their own terms, represented a challenge to this narrative, a challenge that Kentucky's political and social leaders were not willing to confront. The investigation began to uncover instances where the erasure of Anderson's legacy wasn't just a matter of passive neglect but of active suppression. In interviews with locals who had lived through the 20th century, it became apparent that the memory of Anderson had been actively silenced by a network of powerful forces that extended beyond the town's borders. Local newspapers, which had been the main outlets for public discourse, played a role in shaping the historical record by selectively reporting on events that aligned with the prevailing political climate. The abolitionist movement, and by extension, the stories of black abolitionists like Anderson, were rarely discussed, and when they were, it was only in the context of broader national narratives that minimized their significance. Anderson's name was rarely printed in the town's papers, and when it was often associated with rumors or disinformation that portrayed him as an unreliable or even dangerous figure. The role of Kentucky's education system in this historical erasure was equally important. The curriculum taught in schools throughout the state was often sanitized and politically motivated. Black history, particularly the history of black abolitionists, was omitted from textbooks, or, at best, treated as a footnote. Students were taught a version of the past that reinforced the idea that the Civil War was primarily about the preservation of the Union and the end of slavery, without recognizing the contributions of the black men and women who had played such a critical role in their own emancipation. Figures like Elijah Anderson, whose life was a testament to the agency of enslaved people in their fight for freedom, were excluded from the classroom. The state's education system, in this way, became a tool of ideological control, shaping the way future generations would understand their history. What was perhaps most striking, however, was the emotional and psychological toll of Anderson's erasure on the people who lived in Kentucky, both black and white. For the black residents of the town, the deliberate silencing of figures like Anderson reinforced a larger cultural message, that their struggles and sacrifices were not worthy of recognition. It was a painful reminder that, even after the end of slavery, their contributions to the fight for freedom would continue to be overlooked. The absence of black historical figures from the town's collective memory created a sense of displacement, an erosion of identity that made it difficult for black residents to fully connect with their own history. For white residents, especially those who had grown up in the decades following the Civil War, Anderson's erasure was a defense mechanism, a way of shielding themselves from the uncomfortable truths about their state's past. Kentucky, like many southern states, was still in the midst of reconciling with the legacy of slavery and the role that white Southerners had played in perpetuating it. The idea of acknowledging the role of black people in their own emancipation would have forced white residents to confront the uncomfortable reality of the South's historical injustices, a reality that many were not ready to face. The emotional weight of this collective denial created a psychological barrier that prevented the town from fully healing from the wounds of the past. The erasure of Anderson, then, was not only a historical injustice but a psychological one that allowed the town to maintain its denial. The emotional consequences of this erasure were evident when the researcher interviewed elderly black residents who had grown up in the town. Many of them spoke with a sense of frustration and disbelief when recounting how little they had been taught about the abolitionist movement, and how figures like Anderson had been completely overlooked in their education. For these individuals, the discovery of Anderson's story came as a revelation, a reminder that their history was far more complex, far more rich with struggle and triumph, than they had ever been told. For some, learning about Anderson's contributions was a source of empowerment, a way to reclaim a part of their identity that had been denied to them. For others, it was a painful reminder of how much had been lost, the stories, the heroes, the rich legacy of resistance, that had been erased in the pursuit of a more comfortable narrative. As the investigation drew to a close, the final realization was stark: the erasure of Elijah Anderson's legacy was not just a historical accident. It was a deliberate and sustained effort to suppress the truth, to rewrite the past in a way that aligned with the interests of those in power. The silence surrounding Anderson's story was a manifestation of the larger struggle for control over history, a struggle that continues to this day. The effort to suppress his memory was part of a broader attempt to maintain the social and racial hierarchies that had been in place for centuries. By erasing figures like Anderson, those in power could continue to control the narrative and keep the painful realities of the past hidden from view. But despite the best efforts to bury Anderson's story, the truth had a way of rising to the surface. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence, enough stories, and enough witnesses to piece together the outline of a life that had been deliberately obscured. While Anderson's name may have been erased from the town's records, his legacy lived on in the people who remembered him, in the documents that had been hidden away, and in the truth that could no longer be suppressed. Elijah Anderson, the Moses of Kentucky, would no longer be forgotten. His story would be told. The work to reclaim his legacy, though far from finished, had already begun. The emotional and psychological weight of his erasure would be lifted, not just for Anderson's memory, but for all those who had been forced to live in the shadow of a history that had been denied them. The battle for truth and justice was far from over, but Anderson's life had proven one undeniable fact: the truth would eventually emerge, no matter how hard some tried to bury it.